The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Well, season 2 of the Trump presidency is getting off to a pretty fast start. Donald Trump and a lot of his staffers have now been caught in a just massive, gargantuan, monstrous lie yesterday. And it relates to that resignation of the White House staff secretary, Rob Porter, that we've been talking about. We now know that Rob Porter was accused of beating not one, but two ex-wives, and he's no longer working for the Trump administration, but still, as far as we know, dating Donald Trump's communications director, Hope Hicks, although that will probably be a story for a different day, I predict, although today I don't have news about that for you. And the questions about Rob Porter have been, when did the White House know that a security clearance was going to be a problem for Porter because of the allegations that were out there against him? And the Trump White House and Trump and people around Trump, they've all been insisting multiple times that they just didn't know, right? We just had no idea. We found out very recently for the first time, and nobody knew anything. Nobody was covering anything up. Nobody was allowing Porter to be here despite knowing that he had serial wife-beating allegations out there against him. However, we now heard from FBI Director Christopher Wray, who testified yesterday and in no uncertain terms whatsoever said, listen, we started communicating with the Trump White House about Rob Porter's issues in March of 2017, nearly a year ago. Here is Christopher Wray, the FBI director, who of course is only there because of the chain of events started by Donald Trump's firing of James Comey, completely contradicting what the White House has told us about what they knew and when about Rob Porter.
Vice Chairman Warner highlighted in his opening statement the importance of an effective security clearance process.
Right.
So I've got a question for you, Director Wray. Was the FBI aware of allegations related to Rob Porter and domestic abuse? And if so, was the White House informed this could affect his security clearance? When were they informed?
Right.
And who at the White House was informed?
Well, Senator, there's a limit to what I can say about the content of any particular background investigation for a variety of reasons that I'm sure you can appreciate. I would say that the background investigation process involves a fairly elaborate set of standards, guidelines, protocols, agreements, et cetera, that have been in place for 20-plus years. And I'm quite confident that in this particular instance, the FBI followed established protocols.
So was the White House informed that this could affect his security clearance? That's a yes or no.
Right.
I can't get into the content of what was briefed.
What were they informed?
What I can tell you is that the FBI submitted a partial report on the investigation in question in March, and then a completed background investigation in late July.
Huh.
That is, soon thereafter, we received requests for follow-up inquiry, and we did the follow-up and provided that information in November, and then we administratively closed the file in January. And then earlier this month, we received some additional information, and we passed that on as well.
Okay. That's right. The FBI submitted a partial report almost a year ago in March of 2017. They finished the background in July of 2017, and then they had further follow-up later on in 2017. But the resignation didn't happen until February of 2018, and they're all complicit in the lies. Deputy Press Secretary Raj Shah said last Thursday that the background investigation was ongoing. Well, they had an initial completion of that background investigation in July of 2017. Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, an all-around horrible person, said something very similar when asked really specifically whether last Tuesday was the first time that any of this was known. And here's how Sarah Huckabee Sanders responded to the question.
Specifically, though, Had he learned at any time before last Tuesday, when this story was broken by the Daily Mail, that there was any allegation of any sort leveled by any person against Rob Porter?
Again, I can't get into the specifics. I can tell you that the process for the background was ongoing, and the White House had not received any specific papers regarding the completion of that background check. So I can't go any further than what we've already said on that front.
The White House had received no specific papers, except that they had, according to FBI Director Christopher Wray, they had received all the papers because the investigation had been closed. And it gets even worse because it is now being reported that Porter almost became deputy chief of staff. Had this not been broken by media outlets, we might have had Rob Porter deputy chief of staff. There's a tweet from CNN's Brooke Baldwin saying that Caitlin Collins is reporting that just before Rob Porter resigned amid the allegations of spouse abuse, the White House was considering promoting him to deputy chief of staff. Well, they dodged that bullet, I guess we could say. And then the most recent wrinkle is that Sarah Huckabee Sanders says that even though it appears as though the White House is saying one thing and the FBI is saying something different, that they're both somehow telling the truth. The White House is telling the truth and Christopher Wray is telling the truth, which seems hard to believe because they're saying very, very different things. But here is once again Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
You and Raj, and you just said this again, that the investigation was ongoing. Christopher Wray said it was closed in January. So who's telling the truth here?
Both. As I said, the FBI portion was closed. The White House Personnel Security Office, who is the one that makes a recommendation for adjudication, had not finished their process and therefore not made a recommendation to the White House.
And let me just clarify one more point. You said yesterday that you didn't get any paperwork from the FBI. Chris Wray said that he did submit paperwork at all the various moments that were.
Again, that would come through the White House Personnel Security Office, which did not completed their investigation and not pass that information to the White House.
That you did receive paperwork.
Again, the White House, I think you need to be very clear about there's multiple groups here.
Listen, you need to understand that the internal mail system of the White House, sometimes things aren't properly posted. So just because you send papers doesn't mean that the papers are received. It's an unintelligible explanation. And I don't plan on spending too much more time on the Rob Porter thing specifically, although its repercussions I'm glad to continue talking about, because as vile as it is, it just confirms what we already knew about the White House, Pat, which is that there's some undeniable realities here when it comes to sexual abuse, right? And lying. Number one, this confirms Trump lies and people around him lie. We knew that already. Number two, it confirms that Trump and people around him don't really care about sexual assault, right? Exhibit A being Trump is president and has more than a dozen sexual assault allegations against him. And that's why they covered for Porter so long. It just wasn't a big deal to them that he was accused of beating multiple ex-wives.
Well, it is pretty odd to me why the White House would face all this political retribution for the sake of Rob Porter.
Yeah.
Especially because it's not as if Trump is opposed to firing people. He was
course.
doing it once a week. But I think he just doesn't take sexual abuse very seriously. He always believes the men and he never believes the women.
It just doesn't really matter, right? That's the point. It wasn't some concerted effort to cover up Rob Porter. They just don't care about domestic abuse and sexual assault. And if it doesn't, it's not even clear his voters care about it because they voted for Trump despite those dozen allegations. If they cared about this, Trump wouldn't be president in the first place. So the way that this has all been carried out is really no surprise whatsoever. We're finally getting closer to the truth about Donald Trump's alleged affair with porn star Stormy Daniels and the alleged $130,000 payoff that she received. Let's go back to Donald Trump's attorney, Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen has been denying the entire story for a very long time now. But all of a sudden, Michael Cohen now admits, yes, Stormy Daniels did receive a $130,000 payment, but it came out of his own pocket and personal bank account, says Michael Cohen. Now remember, Cohen originally denied that there were payments. He denied that there was an affair. He trumped out into public a totally unbelievable note that Stormy Daniels had supposedly written saying, oh, I never had an affair with Trump and was never paid anything. We could all see through that note very, very easily. And now all of a sudden, Michael Cohen says, yeah, Stormy Daniels was paid. I paid her personally and I was never reimbursed. Now you might be hearing this story and you're saying to yourself, wait, so they got caught, right? They did it. Not really. The lies about the original story became so untenable and so unbelievable that this is the new position they've come up with to try to defend Trump. And you're probably rightly saying, wait, David, hold on. How is this denying the story and defending Trump if Cohen is admitting that he paid $130,000? How is admitting the porn star was paid a defense of Trump? And the reason that it's a defense of Trump is that when Cohen says, I paid her personally, they take Trump out of it. And you can see that this is what they're doing from how they're answering questions and from how Michael Cohen's statement was written about this. Michael Cohen made a statement to the New York Times about this where he said, neither the Trump organization nor the Trump campaign was a party to the transaction with Ms. Clifford, that's Stormy Daniels' real name, and neither reimbursed me for the payment, either directly or indirectly. The payment to Ms. Clifford was lawful and was not a campaign contribution or a campaign expenditure by anyone. So under this new explanation of what happened, they are saying this has nothing to do with Trump. Fine. The reports about Stormy Daniels getting $130K are true, but it has nothing to do with Trump. Trump wasn't involved. It doesn't relate to an affair, and Trump didn't know about it. And in fact, when you look at how the follow-up questions went, Michael Cohen was asked, did Trump know that you made this payment? He didn't answer that question. He was asked, what was the reason that you paid Stormy Daniels $130,000? He didn't answer that one. So they have come up with this new obvious lie, which lets them say, I guess with some plausible deniability, if you buy it, that this has nothing to do with Trump or the campaign. It was a private transaction. Private person Michael Cohen paid private person, porn star Stormy Daniels, who alleges that she had an affair with Donald Trump, $130,000, and it has nothing to do with Trump whatsoever. And of course, this only raises more questions than it answers, right? Like now we're really sure we were onto something with this entire thing.
I want to get me a lawyer like Michael Cohen if he's willing to do that, $130,000 out of his own pocket.
Generous guy.
That's not a small amount of money for anyone, really.
This is a very nice guy to be paying her $130,000. And mostly what this suggests is that the story all along about a Trump affair and the payoff is the correct story. There are some contradictions about the payment. There are investigations going on, including by Common Cause, which say this was actually campaign money that was used to pay off Stormy Daniels. And that would absolutely raise questions about campaign finance law. But this is all sort of a smokescreen because for months, remember, there was no payment. Now, all of a sudden, there was a payment, but it had nothing to do with Donald Trump. It just happens to be a payment to the person who was alleging an affair with Donald Trump with very, very specific details. Why did he give her the money, right? That's the question. Why did he give her the money if the story isn't true?
I think as far as Michael Cohen is concerned, it's all about avoiding any campaign finance violations.
Yeah.
Because this has happened before. I remember John Edwards back in 2008 paid someone off hush money because he was having an affair with a woman. It was like $1 million, and he was later indicted for it.
That's right. And it just doesn't pass the common sense test, right? Putting all of this garbage aside, the misdirection, why would a lawyer secretly pay a porn star who happens to be alleging an affair with his client, right? That it does not pass the common sense test. And of course, why admit this now? Maybe to take attention away from the Rob Porter wife-beating security clearance fiasco, right? Before, they wanted to take away attention from the porn star story. Now they've come up with a way to make a partial admission on the porn star story at a time when the focus is on the entire Chief of Staff John Kelly, Rob Porter fiasco.
Yeah, no other president would be able to get away with all this stuff. I think about Barack Obama or George Bush having an affair. Yeah. There's no way the public would let them go.
It's a scandal whack-a-mole. They're trying to whack one scandal and then another, and it's all becoming an insane gong show. And I hope you'll send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pacman Show.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.
Today's new member of the day is George Soares. George, thank you so much for being a David Pacman Show member. We are mostly funded. We've got the ebbs and flows of different revenue sources over the years, depending on this algorithm or that person closing our account somewhere, Amazon. But we really depend on the steady funding of members, including people like George Soros and longtime sustaining member James Varnum, dating all the way back to 2011. New members, very important. Sustaining members, also very important. And you can join both George and James at davidpakman.com/membership. You can also make a pledge. If you don't want to do the membership thing, you can make a pledge of as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. And we have right around 2,100 patrons there. All very, very exciting stuff. And lastly, cryptocurrency donations. Donate with Bitcoin or Litecoin or Ethereum. Pat wants to donate with Dogecoin, and
Yes.
I told him we're not handling Dogecoin right now.
One
But
day.
that'll be for a different day. davidpakman.com/cryptocurrency. All right, let's get into Hatriot Mail, where a professional voiceover artist interprets hate mail that I receive.
It's like email forwards from your racist grandma on steroids. Hatriot Mail, written by patriots who hate David Pakman because America and because freedom.
This week's Hatriot Mail it's something special. I don't really know how else to say it, but it's something special. Let's take a listen.
More fake news from Dan Parkman. It's interesting to watch all the exposés of faux fake news. Let me guess, you left-wing cucks only think Fox is fake news. Give Parkman credit for trying. Do you mind if I ask the hateful garbage man next door who loves Trump his opinion of you, and then market it to the world?
I think that the Hatriot Mail interpreter gives the writer too much credit when he says exposés, because it's spelled espasy, and it is like nothing I've ever seen before. And it is true. This is a brutal espasy of the Daniel Parkman fake news program, which, of course, is not a program I've ever seen or have any involvement with, but it sounds horrible.
Exposés was in quotation marks, though, so maybe there is some context that we're missing out on.
Yeah, I think the context is the person was smart enough to realize they don't know how to spell expose, and they put it in quotes for no real reason. It's in quotes for the same reason that Trump randomly capitalizes things like fake news.
That's one way to do it. Another way to do it would just be to look it up in the dictionary or spell check.
Does no one have spell check? I really don't understand how it happens. It's weird. I thought spell check was free on most devices now.
Yeah. And one more comment. I would love to hear what the hateful garbage man has to say about the show, if he even knows about it. And you can film that. We'll put it on the show.
What are the politics of garbage men? I'd be curious. I mean, on the one hand, they seem to be stereotyped as sort of blue-collar working class types who might tend to be more conservative. But at the same time, depending on whether you're a commercial or residential garbage man or woman, you're arguably part of a union, potentially part of a union, and they tend to be a little more democratic. Anyway, I would love to hear from the garbage man next door. And you can turn Hatriot Mail, turn it into something positive. The coupon code HATRIOT40 will save you 40% if you use it when you sign up for a membership on our website. Israeli police are recommending criminal charges of corruption and bribery against the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. The police say there's enough evidence. There's enough evidence to indict Benjamin Netanyahu, not only for bribery, but also for fraud and for breach of trust in two totally separate cases. So, first case, Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly asked the publisher of a newspaper in Israel to portray him positively when they talk about him. And in exchange, Benjamin Netanyahu would try to suppress a rival newspaper's success. Not good. Not good. The other case is one about Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly receiving gifts valued at nearly $300,000 from a variety of different supporters, including champagne and cigars, with the idea of getting a Hollywood mogul named Arnon Milchan a U.S. visa. And police say that right after Netanyahu received those gifts, he also started pushing for a law which would allow Israelis who return to live in Israel after living elsewhere for some time to not pay taxes for 10 years. And then lastly, in another case, Netanyahu is suspected of fraud and breach of trust relating to a Russian billionaire named James Packer, who apparently also made a bunch of gifts to Netanyahu and his wife. So obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu is denying the entire thing, and it now is up to the attorney general to decide, are we going to file charges or not? And that could take months. Let's break this down into the sort of broader analysis, right? I've been rallying against Benjamin Netanyahu for what, a decade at this point? I think he's terrible for Israel. I think he is terrible for any reasonable prospect for Palestinian peace. He doesn't want peace, right? Benjamin Netanyahu benefits from a more escalated status quo in Israel. He's also aligned in a coalition with the most vile, retrograde, religious right-wing elements of Israeli politics. It's an alliance that is completely deplorable and depraved. And there's just not going to be any serious steps towards peace when Benjamin Netanyahu is prime minister of Israel. So I think he should have been voted out already, but he hasn't been. So listen, if these crimes are crimes he committed, and that remains to be seen, then this is as good a way as any of getting Benjamin Netanyahu out of power. If this removes him ultimately, then that's great and that's good, even if it's a different sequence than we might have imagined. Now, Netanyahu needs to go one way or the other, right? There's a question as to whether is the attorney general really going to charge a sitting prime minister? And the answer is, well, there's precedent for it. In Israel previously, there have been indictments and charges filed against sitting prime ministers. At the same time, there have also been allegations made against Benjamin Netanyahu in the past that didn't lead to charges, arguably because prosecutors decided we just don't have enough evidence here. If true, these are really serious crimes because they completely undermine the political system. And this is a guy, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been just a totally toxic influence on Israeli politics and on the peace process, the almost non-existent peace process, for which, yes, Benjamin Netanyahu is not the only one to blame. And you know I've talked about that before. But for a long time, he has been an impediment to peace. So am I personally offended by the allegations against Benjamin Netanyahu? No, I've always known that he's basically just a right-wing extremist whose priorities are just not in line with the people of Israel. Do I believe he'll ultimately be charged? I really don't know. But any path to the successful removal of Benjamin Netanyahu is something that we should all be in favor of, because this guy is not going to be good for anybody over the long term. Recent economy-wide consumer prices went up more than expected. In January, there was an expectation that the consumer price index would go up 0.3%. It ended up going up almost twice that amount, 0.5%. And the consumer price index, it's an index. It doesn't measure the price of everything in the economy. It's an index that takes sort of a basic basket of goods, things that most people buy and sort of need for their I don't know what you would call it, the support of their day-to-day lifestyle. And that is tracked by the consumer price index. And this includes things like gasoline, what's called shelter, clothing, medical care, food. And the prices of those items went up in January more than anticipated. So with these stories, it's good to first do like a totally standard neoclassical economic analysis, right? Which is, we've had economic growth over the last many years. We've had a reduction in unemployment. This means that wages have started to trickle up slightly in order to better attract workers, since the pool of unemployed workers you can hire from has become smaller. And that means that in response, some of the prices of basic goods are going to go up as a response, and sort of there you have it, right? So now the question is a period of inflation starting? That's the neoclassical, rational actor, perfectly efficient markets analysis. However, most of us now have gotten beyond that black-white sort of deterministic understanding of economics. Number one, we've learned we're not good at making economic predictions in general. Number two, we've learned that actors in the economy are not actually totally rational. And number three, we've learned that the link between deficit and debt and inflation is not as direct and hard and fast as much of the American right wants us to believe. There's a totally different argument that you could make here. You could look at this data and you could say, well, when you just dump a ton of cash onto people who don't really need it, and I'm talking about the massive tax cuts for the rich that Donald Trump's administration recently passed, that's not economically stimulative spending, but it can have the effect of driving up the price of goods. Now, to be clear, I'm speculating because the more I study economics, and I've shared this with you before, the more I study economics, the more I learn how terrible we are at making predictions and even at pointing to causal relationships, except in retrospect, right? After we have an event, humans are really good at looking back and saying, here is a perfect, coherent narrative about why it happened. But if we were actually so good at it, we'd be able to be better at predicting what it is that's going to happen ahead of time, and we're not. We're simply not. So as far as action items, if you're in the camp that believes inflation is coming, we're about to have major inflation in the United States, which will probably come with interest rate increases from the Fed, you might want to get a mortgage sooner than later, right? If you're thinking about in the next 3 or 4 years buying a home and getting a new mortgage, if you believe the narrative that inflation is coming and is going to be accelerating, then that might be a reason to get that mortgage sooner than later. We'll follow it, right? But rest assured that no matter what happens, if anything bad happens to the economy, the current administration will blame President Obama. And if anything good happens in the economy, the current administration will take 100% credit for it and praise the great Donald Trump for having turned things around from where President Obama left off. That you can be sure of ahead of time. Beyond that, we're pretty terrible at predicting anything. You can discuss this with us on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. We'll take a break. We've got a great interview coming up today and a lot more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Viveca Novak, who is an investigative editor for McClatchy's Washington Bureau. She's been a journalist in Washington, D.C. for more than 20 years. Viveca, it's so great to talk to you. You have been following what appears to be a sort of funding funnel from Russia through the NRA and to Donald Trump. How was this even something that initially got on your radar?
Well, we had been hearing actually for quite some time that this may have been happening, and it took us months and months to get a second source on it. But we were eventually able to get a second source saying that Robert Mueller's investigation is looking into whether Russian money was funneled through the NRA to help Trump.
Is there anything that separates the legality or illegality of Russian money to Trump through the NRA versus all the other hypothetical avenues that have been explored or mentioned so far?
Well, you're right. There are a number of avenues. One thing that is pretty clear is that it is illegal to use foreign money to influence a U.S. election. So that if the NRA was using Russian money in its expenditures to help Trump, which were considerable in the 2016 election, then that would pretty clearly be illegal.
Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I'm interested in both the story itself, but also how you work a story like this. So what is the sort of first step in starting to source a story like this? What is the sort of work on the ground that is done?
Well, we've been working the Trump-Russia story since January or before, and we were the first U.S. outlet to publish a story saying that the connection was under investigation, Russian interference in the election was under investigation, and that they were looking at the Trump campaign. And that eventually became Robert Mueller's investigation when he was named special counsel later last year. So we have been working a number of sources to try to figure out what exactly happened and what Mueller's team is looking at since then. And so this is a process of building. You build sources who may lead you to other sources, and you circle back to your sources, and you try to get any documentary evidence you can. It's a laborious, time-consuming process, and McClatchy is not being the Washington Post or the New York Times. We sometimes don't get the same kind of leaks from on high that some of the more prominent news organizations do. But I have to hand it to our reporters. We've got a great team with a lot of experience, and they've been dogged in this.
Are there long periods of time in an investigation like this where just sort of nothing really happens?
Yes.
And like what
Yes.
do you just work on other stories during that time, or is there a lot of sort of waiting around for sources in some sense?
Well, I think from the reporter's standpoint, there's a lot of fretting when your sources aren't getting back to you. You haven't learned anything lately, you know, what's happening. So there is a lot of sort of fretting time, I call it. And I think reporters in general, it's not like you're sitting still. You are working other angles of the story. You're trying to meet people. You're trying to set up coffees. You're doing this or that in the usual reporting process. From an editor's standpoint, you're kind of sitting there thinking, when is this going to happen? Is it going to happen? So there's probably more downtime for someone like me in an editor position than there is for the reporters.
I want to start digging into sort of the meat of the story in a second, but one more sort of question in terms of process. It's become very, very sort of popular for people who hear a story that they don't necessarily like the implications of to say, hey, you know, it lists anonymous sources, it's not naming the people, and there's this sort of reflexive tendency increasingly to write off any story that doesn't name sources. But this misses something that's really important, which is that when you, for example, say, we have two sources familiar with the matter, that's very different than saying we have an anonymous source or we have three sources who work within X or Y department. The wording of how sources are named actually carries a lot of weight in these types of stories. Can you talk about that a little bit and the meaning of that?
Well, it does. It's always a tricky balancing act because you want to protect your source who, you know, may be fearful of losing their job or may be disclosing something that is confidential or sometimes even classified. So you want to protect that source, and at the same time, you want to give the reader a little bit of information to indicate that you're not just, you know, pulling this from someone on the street. So we do try to do that, but it's tricky sometimes.
Let's talk now about sort of the meat and the funneling of this funding. We know that the NRA spent a lot of money in the 2016 election, including $30 million in support of Donald Trump. That's a lot more than they spent in 2012 backing Mitt Romney, for example. So talk to us a little bit about the process of your investigation and sort of the details of how this all was arguably put together.
Well, yes, we knew that the NRA spent 3 times as much money in 2016 backing Trump as it did in 2012 backing Mitt Romney. We also knew that there was this Russian named Torshin, Alexander Torshin, who was a very enthusiastic NRA supporter and came over for some of the annual conventions the NRA has. And I mean, in the process of building the information, we learned that, you know, Donald Trump Jr. had been to one of the NRA's conventions and had spoken with this Torshin fellow, that Torshin had hosted a big delegation of NRA officials over in Russia and had started up a sort of Russian offshoot, in a way, of the NRA called the Right to Bear Arms. So there were a number of pieces of information that we began accumulating, and it was kind of, you know, it was kind of a matter of trying to figure out whether this could have happened. And, you know, again, we don't know whether it happened, but we do know that it is being investigated by the Mueller team.
People might hear us talking about this and they might say, not unreasonably, that it should be as simple as just looking at the list of the NRA's donors. But as your investigation turned up, it's not quite so simple, is it?
Well, for one thing, you can't look at a list of the NRA's donors. The NRA does not make its members or donors public.
Right.
And the group, the offshoot that it uses to spend money in the elections is a 501c4 nonprofit that doesn't have to disclose its donors. So yeah, that is not, that would be great, but it is not exactly how you can get any information.
Bigger picture, what do you see as the most likely sort of eventual conclusion of everything that's going on with Trump and Russia? I mean, I'm hearing from people that run the full gamut, from impeachment, indictment, all the way to this is going to evaporate with nothing conclusive and really no major charges from Robert Mueller. You've been following this for a long time. Do you have any opinion as to what's the most likely outcome here?
I have been following it for a long time, as has my team, and I would say I don't know what the outcome will be. You have a couple of people under indictment who may be going to trial in August or September of this year. There may be more people cooperating that we don't know about. I think there probably are. What's it all going to boil down to? Is it going to boil down to accusations about money laundering against Trump that would have happened probably before the election? Is it going to boil down to some kind of collusion isn't a legal term, but cooperation or conspiring with Russia to interfere in the elections? Is it going to come down to obstruction of justice? There are some data points there that are kind of convincing. But we don't know ultimately. We know that Robert Mueller has a number of strands of his investigation he's following. We don't know which ones, if any, are going to eventually result in, something that would be critical of or charging the president. Or if he would produce a report and that would be sent to Congress and impeachment proceedings may or may not start. It's ultimately still just very up in the air.
To sort of approach the question from a slightly different angle, at this point, would you be surprised if it fizzled basically from this point forward and nothing more really came of it? Would that be a surprising outcome to you?
I'd be surprised if it fizzled and nothing more came of it. Yeah, I would be. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, Donald Trump will be the subject of a very critical report. There could be something involving Jared Kushner, or there could be other people who will be either charged or the subject of a very critical report in the end.
We've been speaking with Viveca Novak. She is an investigative editor for McClatchy's Washington Bureau, which has been doing some excellent work. Thank you so much for talking to us about this.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The White House and the president have a habit of acknowledging tragedies, killings specifically, when they are politically advantageous to them, and then ignoring them when they are not so advantageous. And we've seen this pattern with incidents of violence committed by Muslims, which Trump is very quick and eager to talk about, compared to violence where either Muslims are the victims or when the violence is perpetrated by good old American-born white dudes. And the perpetrators are not anybody that Trump all of a sudden wants to talk about, right? But there is one sort of overarching category of violent acts that Donald Trump has been ignoring almost in total, never mind on an event-by-event basis. And I'm talking about people killed by the alt-right and or white supremacists. More than 100 people have been murdered or injured by the white supremacist / alt-right movement. And 9 of these incidents took place in 2017 during Donald Trump's presidency. And Donald Trump has not mentioned these incidents. Very little time is ever devoted to covering these incidents by corporate media, although we've been making an effort to talk about them. And of the 100+ that have been killed or injured by alt-right nuts or white supremacist extremists or whoever, of the 100+, 43 have been black, brown, or Muslim. And not a word from Donald Trump about them. And thanks to the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center, we have data about these incidents. And from the SPLC's report, they say, quote, these perpetrators were all male, and with the exception of 3 men, all under the age of 30 at the time they are alleged to have killed. The average age of the alt-right killers is 26. The youngest was 17. One, Alexander Bissonnette, is Canadian, but the rest are American. While some certainly displayed signs of mental illness, all share a history of consuming and or participating in the type of far-right ecosystem that defines the alt-right. And yet no tweets from Trump, nothing. The closest he came to talking about these types is to say that after the Charlottesville fiasco, where neo-Nazis marched, Trump said there were fine people on both sides, including on the side of the white supremacists and the alt-rightists. And I want to add something else here. Alt-right doesn't necessarily mean neo-Nazi or white supremacist, right? I already know, Pat, that we're going to get emails from people saying, David, you're conflating alt-right and white supremacist. I'm not. There's alt-right and there's white supremacist, and they're not necessarily the same thing, but there is a lot of overlap, and a lot of neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideology has been sort of rebranded successfully as alt-right through the existence of the Trump presidency and campaign earlier on. And that makes it sound way better. It makes it sound way less threatening, but it's still the same toxic, vile drivel that we're familiar with. And this is part of the bigger context of normalization of extreme views. One of the biggest effects of the Trump candidacy and presidency has been not policy, for example, although we talk about policy, not the destruction of the reputation of the United States around the world as a result of Trump being in the White House, although we've talked about that as well. It's been the normalization of extreme ideas. That is a major trend of the Trump White House and the impact of it. And we've got to keep working against that normalization because it's happening very aggressively. And when it also becomes real world violence, we often don't hear about it because it's swept under the rug and not covered at all.
Yeah, and of course, all murders and tragedies should be avoided, and
yes,
those people should be condemned in all cases.
They're all tragic,
regardless of if they are immigrants or Muslims or people from the alt-right. But you see Trump picking out the specific anecdotes that align with his worldview and his political agenda, and he ignores the other ones. And that's really the problem with anecdotes. They're not statistically significant.
That's exactly right. That's when an anecdote about someone coming over the physical U.S.-Mexico border as a justification for changing this or that law or building a wall ignores the statistical reality that most people here illegally are not actually crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. They're overstaying visas or coming in other ways. It's really a shame, and it really does expose the just totally blatant political nature of everything that the Trump administration has been doing. You know, of course, about America First. You know about Make America Great Again. You know about Hire American. You know about Mexico isn't sending us their best people. You know about all that crap that we've heard from the Trump administration. Vox has just finished up a really good analysis of the hiring of 144 workers in seasonal positions at Trump properties in New York and Florida. And of the 144 jobs, 1 went to U.S. workers from 2016 to the end of 2017. The other 143 Trump organization jobs went to foreign workers with H-2B visas. When you hire with an H-2B visa, you actually first have to try to hire in the United States, and then if you're not able to find someone qualified in the U.S., then you can go to foreign workers. These were positions at Trump businesses for servers, cooks, housekeepers, and bartenders. Not the highest skilled jobs in the world. Yet Mr. America First himself can't seem to find anyone in a country of 325 million people to work. And it's also fascinating how Trump wants to make cuts to a ton of visa programs that actually make sense. But then the H-2B visa, which is a way for American companies to legally hire cheap foreign labor, that visa Trump likes, and in fact temporarily expanded the H-2B visa program as president, which allowed him to hire even more low-paid foreign labor at his clubs and his resorts. This is a con artist, okay? And this is not a story where I am coming to you and saying, hey, listen, immigration is good or immigration is bad, or H-2B visas are good or bad, or we should have more of them or less of them. What I'm telling you is that Trump is a bamboozling con artist who says buy American. He says hire American workers. He says America first. He complains that immigrants are undercutting American workers at a lower salary, but then he's making the problem worse. Here's one tweet, okay? This is just one tweet from Trump on this from Inauguration Day, where Trump said, we will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. Hashtag Inauguration Day, hashtag Make America Great Again. So what's a possible explanation or a defense to this, right? Well, one that we sometimes hear is, and we've heard it from Trump before, Americans didn't want the jobs. Well, if Americans didn't want the jobs when you were using H-2B visas to hire in 2016 and in 2015 and in 2014, the economy must have been doing pretty damn well under Obama that nobody wanted the jobs that you were offering at Mar-a-Lago or wherever else. The hypocrisy of which is that if that's true, then what he's basically saying is we need immigrant labor for our businesses to succeed, which then should inform his policy position, you would imagine, but it doesn't, right? And this is actually a really good exercise because it shows us that you can see Trump's real position on issues through his business decisions. We often say, you know, Trump says this, but he also said that. And then someone else suggested this third position, and he said that's actually his new position. The campaign trail statements, the tweets, all that stuff, it doesn't tell us anything. Look at what Trump has done in his businesses to know what his positions are. He wants to hire foreign workers because that's actually his position, that's totally fine. He wants to build a wall, not with the not on the U.S.-Mexico border. He wants to build a wall around his golf club in Scotland or wherever it was because he recognizes privately that climate change could sink his golf course. But publicly he says, oh, it's a hoax created by the Chinese. We can actually figure out Trump's real positions, and it depends on looking at his business decisions, and it has nothing to do with his public policy.
Well, there certainly are contradictions there, like when he tries to pay the least amount in taxes that he can, or not hire Americans, hire immigrants instead. But I think he would argue that it's not incumbent on him to do the right thing. It's incumbent on the government to make the policies.
Come on.
And I don't know, I'm trying to make a counter-argument.
Yeah, I mean, they've said that with the entire Ivanka's clothes and his clothes are made in China or wherever, right? Which is like, listen, we're playing the game within the law given the circumstances of globalization and the economy. Let's change the world such that it's better for us to buy American. But it's just so stupid because if he wants to do the right thing, if he wants to set an example, accept a slightly smaller profit and have the ability to tout that you're producing your clothes in the United States, right?
Yeah, and it's why I'm so surprised that in 2016 it didn't really stick that this guy really is a con man.
Yeah. That
the Trump University stuff and him hiring Polish immigrants, that people didn't really recognize that stuff when they went to the voting booths.
Yeah.
Because it's a clear case of that.
I don't know that it's that they didn't recognize it. I just think ultimately, number one, they didn't care. And number two, they were fatigued because it was like a new scandal every day. It was a new lie exposed every single day. And this is what you've got. Okay, 143 of 144 hired from foreign countries on H-2B visas. We've got a voicemail number, and that number is 2192-DAVID-P, and I punched my mic because I'm just so excited about today's voicemail. There's a conversation now developing around this SJW thing that some say is pervading the left like a virus. Here's another voicemail about it. Take a listen.
Why do you say that social justice warriors is a small fringe of the left? They seem to be all over TV, the internet, college campuses, everywhere. And why is it that the only people you think are criticizing them are the alt-right? A lot of these people that are criticizing them are also people who are on the left as well,
yeah, like me,
and are worried that their constant talking about certain words is devaluing their meaning and hurting society as a whole. I mean, come on, how can you just deny that?
I am a harsh critic of extreme political correctness, language policing, safe spaces, and a lot of this other stuff that takes place. It's just not the biggest issue or even close to it. So yeah, I know that there are people on the left who also criticize so-called SJWs, or at least some of the destructive elements of what those so-called SJWs do. I'm one of those people, but it's not the biggest problem or even a major problem right now. It is a problem that is compartmentalized within areas of the left, but the big picture is it's not that big of an issue. It's just not.
I'd like to see polling on this, though. Like, what portion of people on the left are social justice warriors? I don't know if that's been done before, but I'd like to see
poll.
it.
It's a losing poll because as it is, the term has already become an ad hominem. It's like polling the left and saying, how many of you are regressive liberals?
Right.
Who's going to self-identify that way, right? I mean, it's gotten so disconnected from reality that it barely even makes any coherent sense. And that's how you end up with voicemails like this one.
And I think the caller is right in that they are very vocal, and you see them on college campuses, and you see them on TV. But you have to recognize that's not necessarily representative of the larger population of the left.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. We've got a tremendously good bonus show for you today. I hope you'll watch. You can access it by becoming a member at davidpakman.com/membership or by becoming a patron for at least $5 a month at patreon.com/David Pakman
Show. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.